Welcome, everyone. This is Chris Parent with LearnWebLogicOnline.com, and welcome to my webinar on 5 WebLogic security tips that every IT specialist should know. Now, in this presentation, I want to talk about how you can ensure your enterprise deployment of WebLogic is secure from external or internal threats. Now, this may sound like a very optimistic promise to you, but I am going to cover some key tips that you can implement to ensure that your environment is secure. This webinar is not meant to cover every security topic related to WebLogic or to networking or computers in general. Obviously, the scope of that is just well beyond this webinar and would be impossible to cover in such a short amount of time. So I really want to focus on 5 key areas of WebLogic that you need to be cognizant of and actions that you can hopefully take today or tomorrow to implement to ensure your environment's secure. Some of this may seem like common sense. Some of it may be new or come to a surprise to you. So I will try to provide some guidance in these areas. So who am I? My name's Chris. I'm the educator owner of LearnWebLogicOnline.com. I've got degrees in computer science and engineering. I've got a background in software development, been doing that for quite a long time. Haven't done it recently, though. Now I focus mostly on cloud architectures centered around Oracle Fusion middleware. That includes WebLogic, SOA Suite, SOA 12c, Service Bus, BPM, identity management, and so on and so forth. So my most of my life has been centered around Fusion middleware. So the first tip I want to share with you in securing your enterprise deployment of WebLogic is secure the installation. Well, what does that mean? When we install WebLogic, we have a tendency to use, or any product for that matter, we tend to segregate products by user, or even functions within products by user. When we install WebLogic, it is recommended that we use a single user for everything. And I'm talking, by everything I mean a single user owns Oracle Home, the domain home, and all the runtime processes. So you can have a single or multiple Oracle homes depending on how you install your Oracle products. So, Oracle Database has an Oracle home. WebLogic has an Oracle home now, introduced in 12c. Fusion middleware products that live on top of WebLogic have their own Oracle homes, or they can be combined. Typically, you don't combine the database Oracle home, as that should be living physically on a separate server. But for products like SOA, OSB, or BPM, or identity management, we should try to consolidate these into a single Oracle home where possible, where the same version can be supported in a single Oracle home. And that Oracle home should be owned by a single user. That makes life a lot easier to manage both the product install and the runtime. And so the domain home should also be owned by a single WebLogic user, or a single OS user, I should say. And that same user should be used for running the processes, for running the WebLogic managed servers and the node manager as well. And the reason for having a single user is that security best practices say that the fewer users you have, the less risk you have to be compromised. So there's fewer accounts that can be hacked into, so to speak. So we try to reduce the number of accounts on a given system. And also, like I mentioned, it's also easier to maintain when you have a single WebLogic OS user that owns Oracle Home, Domain Home, and the runtime as well. The second thing to do when it comes to securing the installation is to not deploy development components in production. And so what I mean by this is that don't deploy any of the sample code that comes out of the box with WebLogic. When you create a WebLogic domain, you have the ability to when you install WebLogic or any of the other Fusion middleware components, a lot of times these come with sample applications, sample domains, sample code, sample applications. Do not deploy these. Okay, these are not necessarily secure applications or secure domains. right? They're just sample codes, sample domains intended for development purposes. So we do not want these deployed and available on your production system. And the other thing to be careful of, don't deploy any IDEs as well. This may seem kind of obvious to some folks, but we don't want any sort of development tooling available in production systems. Back in the old days with Oracle WebLogic, I should say BEA WebLogic 10 and Oracle WebLogic 11G, Eclipse used to come with WebLogic, or JDeveloper as it is now. And we don't want those installed on the production system. Somebody could compile code, write an application, deploy it. There are native integrations between these IDEs and WebLogic. We certainly don't want those running on production systems. And there could be other sample applications or code being installed with WebLogic. Perhaps Derby might pose a security risk. So when we deploy and create a WebLogic domain, we get Derby out of the box. That should not be deployed in a production environment. And one other tip that I see happen quite often, please remove the demo certificates. When we install WebLogic into a production environment, WebLogic delivers a set of private keys and digital certs that are intended for demo purposes only. They're fine in development if you want to configure SSL, but these demo certificates, demo identity and demo trust, come with every WebLogic download, every WebLogic install. So if you install WebLogic and you're using the demo certs, I can go ahead and download WebLogic and get access to the same certificate that you're using to secure your environment. And then, possibly I could use that cert to access your systems if you're protecting it using SSL. So keep in mind, when you install in production, do not use demo certs. I recommend either self-signed certs for internal traffic, if you want to secure internal admin traffic, or certainly get a CA signed certificate if you're exposing this to the open internet. And I'll get into more detail on certificates later on in this course. Okay, so when in production, deploy domains in production, not development. So there are two domain modes that WebLogic supports. There's development mode and production mode. And the differences between the two are listed right here on the screen. When we deploy domains in development mode, we typically don't require a password or any sort of change control in the admin console to make changes to a given domain via the admin console. Yes, you've got to log into the admin console, but starting up, shutting down servers doesn't require a username and password typically with a script in development mode. And there's also this auto deployment feature as well. So as a developer, when I used to develop, I had an auto deploy directory in my domain. And if I wanted to quickly deploy an application to the admin server, I could drop it into this auto deploy directory, and WebLogic would be polling that directory. And when it saw an error or WAR file, it would deploy it. You don't want anything like that in production. You don't want people inadvertently dropping files into a directory that could get automatically deployed. Especially, and this only applies to the admin server. So we should not be running production applications on an admin server anyway. So when we enable production domain mode, we disable the ability to do an auto deployment. Also, it has an impact on the JDK. So the JRE running WebLogic runs in server mode versus client mode. And also stack trace errors aren't displayed in the log files and on the screen. Those are suppressed. So as you can imagine, stack trace errors may reveal information that you wouldn't necessarily want your end users to see or some malicious actor to see. Okay, so this one may seem obvious, but in production environments, it's very easy to not necessarily overlook, but implement. So if you've got an enterprise where you're supporting tens, hundreds, if not thousands of deployments, and some of them are using WebLogic, patching is a real problem. Well, WebLogic isn't perfect. Like every other product out there, bugs are discovered, security holes are found, and Oracle does a pretty good job of patching these systems, and there are various different types of patches that Oracle puts out. There are patch set updates, hot fixes, and critical patch updates. And these critical patch updates are roll-ups of all these security patches, and they're released on a quarterly basis. So when we're patching an environment, it's not important just to patch WebLogic with the latest set of patches, but it's important to patch the database as well, of course, the JDK, and obviously the operating system. So all these things need to be and should be kept up to the latest patch sets in your production environment. And if you recall, several months back, there was the whole OpenSSL Heartbleed issue, and that had a direct impact on probably thousands, if not millions, of environments out there, and WebLogic was susceptible to that. And I know where I work, we were scrambling to apply patches to plug the SSL v3, Poodle attack, and Heartbleed bugs. So with that said, it's not enough to actually do the patching, but if you work in operations, if anybody on this webinar works in DevOps or supports operations directly, you probably have a policy for patching. What do you patch? When do you patch? How do you patch? By minimizing, during your maintenance windows, how do you minimize downtime? Do you roll the patch out? Is it a rolling patch upgrade? And so there definitely needs to be a process around how we patch, not necessarily what we patch. I could tell you to go download this critical patch update from June, but that's not enough. You need to have a policy and a roadmap and a plan as to how we apply these patches in production. If you only have a couple servers to worry about, it's not necessarily a big deal. But if you're supporting WebLogic in a data center with hundreds, thousands of customers, then clearly a plan is needed to roll out patching. So in summary, to secure installation of WebLogic in a production environment, one, use a dedicated user. So the fewer users that you have on a server in a production environment, the less exposed you are. Number two, do not install development components. So don't leave tools on the system that hackers or malicious actors can use to build other tools or gain access to your environment. 3, remove and never use demo certificates in your production environment. These demo certificates are available to anybody out there on the internet that has access to download Oracle WebLogic. They're not specific to your installation. Number 4, deploy domains in production mode. Production mode locks down your WebLogic domain and enforces stricter controls, access controls on that domain. And lastly, patch everything. Bugs are always found. Security holes are always found. I hate to say it, but that's the reality. So always patch. And come up with a plan. Okay, so the second tip on securing WebLogic in your enterprise is to secure the network. So we're not going to talk about WebLogic, the product specifically, but let's talk about the environment that WebLogic lives in. And that's why I want to talk about network security. So as an architect, I don't just architect like a WebLogic domain per se. I'm responsible for helping folks understand the environment around WebLogic, the environment that has to support WebLogic. So it's not just configuring JDBC settings or understanding how to configure a topic or a queue. It's really, as an architect, you've got to think, or a DevOps person, you got to think outside of WebLogic necessarily, because there are things that WebLogic exposes that need to be protected, that WebLogic can't protect by itself. It needs help. And so when we talk about securing the network, we're talking about understanding network architectures and deploying WebLogic in an N-tier architecture with network ACLs or firewalls. So a couple tips here. Never directly expose WebLogic to the internet. WebLogic exposes several ports, and there's different ways to get into WebLogic, and you should really restrict how your end users are accessing your applications deployed to WebLogic. Second, use an N-tier deployment architecture to segregate and isolate functions. What the heck does this mean? Well, I'll show you on the next slide what this looks like. But essentially, we're talking about demilitarized zones. We're talking about middle application tiers. We're talking about data tiers, and all these are segregated by ACLs or firewalls. And the third point I want to make is that administrative functions should only be accessible from within your network, not outside of your network. And there's ways that you can lock this down and prevent the general public from accessing any administrative functions for WebLogic domain. So when I'm talking about an N-tier architecture, this is an example of such an architecture. So you can see here that we have, going from left to right, we have the internet or the intranet coming in, but our environment is kind of segregated into 3 zones. We have our demilitarized zone, or DMZ, which has our load balancer or proxies. So in your enterprise deployment, you may have an F5 sitting in front of your, on top of your enterprise deployment. And so the F5 is responsible for doing, it can serve as a proxy, it can serve as an SSL terminator, it can serve as a load balancer. That's right, it's a hardware load balancer in essence. And so the F5 can implement ACLs at that point and restrict traffic and direct traffic to certain servers in your application tier. So the next tier that we have is the application tier. This is where your WebLogic deployment is going to live. This is where your ears or wars are going to be deployed to. And then beneath that is the data tier. This is where your network attack storage or network storage is deployed to, like a ZFS storage appliance. This is where your database is going to live. So it's important, and this is, there's other ways to slice and dice this, but it's important, and it's certainly more secure to separate functions using ACLs and firewalls. And so in this diagram, we have the firewall is restricting incoming traffic from the internet over HTTPS. It's only allowing HTTPS traffic coming in on 443. And the load balancer is then responsible for reverse proxying that connection to WebLogic. And the ACL between the DMZ and the application tier is only letting application traffic in on 8001. So it's not wide open because WebLogic exposes a lot of ports. So if you've got admin server and several managed servers, there are multiple ports that could be exposed. And so the ACLs allow you to restrict application traffic based on port and protocol to a given server or servers. And we can also see that here between the application tier and the data tier, that the ACL is only permitting SQLnet connectivity over 1521 to our Oracle database. Same with NFS over 2049, which I think is the default port for NFS if you've got shared storage. A lot of times you'll have a multi-cluster WebLogic deployment and you could have shared storage between those nodes. So anyway, the whole point of this is to illustrate the use of ACLs in a multi-tier architecture for WebLogic. And the other thing I want to mention, on the previous slide, I talked about not exposing admin traffic to the open internet or to a client network. And so in this diagram, we've got the intranet on the left-hand side. The intent here is that admin traffic is only allowed in from the intranet, and that an admin console, let's say for WebLogic, is not exposed to the internet. So whether you have access to the intranet over a VPN or you're physically in that network, in that environment, say at a corporate office, or you're working in the data center, this traffic needs to be segregated from the application traffic. We do not want admin consoles exposed to the open internet. Tip number 3, secure the domain. So this kind of goes with the secure the installation of the product, the WebLogic product itself. Now I want to talk about securing the WebLogic domain. So one thing we can do is that we can use SSL to encrypt network traffic within a WebLogic domain, to, from, or within a WebLogic domain. And so recommend creating strong server certificates. This means not using the demo identity and demo trust that come with WebLogic. That's certainly not strong. But we're talking certificates with at least 24-bit key length. Use strong ciphers. So there are a list of supported ciphers depending on the version of the JDK that you're using with WebLogic. The JDK supports certain types of ciphers, so make sure that you understand what those ciphers are and whether or not they're going to meet your needs. So the more restrictive you are on your cipher selection, the smaller your cipher suite, the more secure you are. However, there are a lot of times where if a client needs to negotiate with a server, if they don't have that particular cipher in their supported suite, then they're not going to be able to talk to you. So just understand that. And a lot of companies, especially where I work, we have requirements as to which cipher suites are available for use. So for instance, we can't use CBC ciphers, and they need to be a certain key length. They have to be stronger than 256-bit. It's got to be AES encryption. So keep those things in mind. You may have a corporate policy actually already in place, and if you don't, you probably need to start talking to your corporate security folks, whoever those are. Disable SSL v3. This is highly vulnerable. This introduces the poodle attack and a couple other attacks I can't think off the top of my head. So you can disable SSL v3 using a flag. What I do recommend is anything above TLS 1.0. So I think there's 1.0, 1.1, and 1.2, and there are flags that you can set at the JVM level to enable TLS. Self-signed certs. Obviously, CA signed certs cost money. They take time to get. They are very good and almost a necessity for public-facing services. Anything that's being used for internal traffic, internal use only, self-signed certs, personally, I think are perfectly fine. We use self-signed certs internal where I work because, frankly, it's not cost-effective to generate thousands of CA-signed certificates for internal admin traffic. So we generate strong self-signed certs internally. And this would only be used for administrative traffic within a WebLogic domain. We would not use a self-signed certificate for a managed server that was exposing an application to a client, to the general public, or even that client's private network. Next, enforce security constraints on digital certificates. This is very important. There are flags within WebLogic that will do validation checks on the digital certificates themselves. And by default, these are enabled. A lot of times developers will disable these security constraints to work around issues within development to make life easy. Just make sure that those flags, those changes to reduce the security posture of WebLogic don't get propagated to a production deployment. Very important, always use hostname verification. Hostname verification is a feature within WebLogic. So when what this does is it checks the incoming request, where the incoming request is coming from, so the fully qualified domain name of the client or the host, against what's in the X509 certificate or the SSL certificate. And if there's a mismatch, then WebLogic will reject that request. And this is intended to prevent man-in-the-middle attacks. So anybody can get a hold of a certificate and send that certificate, or present that certificate, I should say, to a client in a one-way SSL connection. The hostname verification just does a cross-check against who's presenting that certificate and what's in the certificate. And last but not least, I'll say it again, do not use demo certs. So I kind of already touched on this. I'm going to blow through this really quick, but this is a little more in-depth look. Use production mode for your domains. Like I said, the settings are more secure. You need a username and password to deploy applications. Stack trace errors are not displayed. There are stricter controls around making domain changes. This basically means that when I log into a domain, I now have to obtain a lock and edit. So, in development mode, multiple people could have logged into an admin console and made changes at the same time. You can see that being a problem, obviously. So if it's just yourself, not a big deal. But in production mode, you actually have to obtain a lock on the domain configuration in order to make any changes. Okay, very important tip. I've talked about segregating application traffic from administrative traffic. So what do I mean by administrative traffic? Well, the administrative traffic is the traffic that the admin server uses to talk to the managed servers and vice versa, as well as node manager. So all that traffic where the admin servers talk to the managed servers to make or push domain changes, or the managed servers to communicate heartbeat messages back to the admin server, or node manager to control lifecycle of all the servers, that is all considered administrative traffic. And that traffic can be segregated from your application traffic. And we do this through enabling the domain-wide administration port. There's a dedicated port. Now, this is a flag that can be set at the domain level and is also set at the managed server level. So by enabling domain-wide administration ports, you are segregating admin traffic to a dedicated port, a new port. This is not... So on a typical WebLogic server, say a managed server, you have an unsecure port and then you have a secure listen port. And the domain admin port is a third port that you don't readily see in the admin console. It's under the advanced settings. But when we enable the domain-wide admin port, all admin traffic goes over this dedicated port or dedicated network channel. Another benefit to the domain-wide admin port is that this network channel, runs on a separate thread from the primary channel. So the primary network channel supports both the secure and unsecure listen ports, which is what your application uses by default. And the benefit to running on a separate thread is that when let's say an application is consuming too many resources and there are stuck threads and the server is just pegged from a resource utilization perspective. Well, there are a lot of times where an application can consume that server and I can't access that server via the admin console or some other, say, WLST script. I'm unable to access that server because the admin traffic and the secure or unsecure channel are on the same application thread. And so when that thread becomes stuck, I can no longer administer that server. By having a dedicated domain administration port, the application is free to foul itself up, and I can still manage that server because I have a dedicated thread, a dedicated port that is not competing with the application. This does require a dedicated port, as I mentioned, but it forces you to enable and configure SSL on all your servers. So when you enable the domain-wide admin port at the domain level, which is where you enable it, every server in your domain is required to have identity and trust configured. This obviously impacts all WebLogic servers, including Node Manager. So Node Manager must now be configured with SSL to communicate over SSL to your WebLogic servers using the new port. So this is, like I said, this is a different port altogether, which you can override on a server-by-server basis. So the domain-wide admin port may be misleading in the sense that when you hear domain-wide admin port, it means like a single port to rule them all, like the Lord of the Rings, right? By default, when you enable domain-wide admin port, it will configure the same admin port number for all your WebLogic server instances. Obviously, if you have multiple WebLogic server instances on a single VM, you're going to have port conflicts. Well, you can override the admin port on a server-by-server basis via the admin console. And so here's a screenshot of where this gets set. So you can see here we have a screenshot of the admin server settings within the admin console. We have the listen address, and the listen port is enabled by default. We're using the default port 7001 here. If I scroll down under the advanced settings, I've highlighted in this red box, this is the local administration port override 9001. When I enable, and by the way, I don't have a screenshot for it, but to enable the admin port, there's a flag at the domain at the domain level within the admin console. But once you enable the domain-wide admin port, you can no longer access administrative functions over 7001. You have to go to 9001. If you try to access the admin console or connect to the admin server over 7001, you're going to get an error. Okay. Tip number 5. This is the last one. Secure your passwords. I know this seems like ridiculous, but you'd be surprised how people don't secure their passwords, or they don't do it sufficiently. So define a password policy. Most corporations have a password policy, a corporate password policy. Make sure this gets enforced using the password validator within WebLogic. You get one out of the box with WebLogic, it's disabled by default. So you have to go in through the admin console and enable it. Okay. So you can see here in the security realm of your domain, under providers, password validation, there's a system password validator. If you click on this, you'll be able to define and implement your corporate password policy, password length, expiration, lockout, and retry. So this is great if you are using the embedded LDAP as your security store, or if you're using another directory service like OID or OUD. Okay, I know. Never use plain text passwords. A lot of times, especially if you're in DevOps, we have a lot of WebLogic scripts that we can run from the command line. We use them for starting up. We use them for shutting down. We use them, maybe using them as part of a chef deployment where we're automating a domain install or domain creation, or we're scaling out an environment, or we're reconfiguring a resource within WebLogic, like a data source or a data pool or a JMS server. Well, we have to connect to the admin server in order to execute these scripts. And a lot of times I see people just type the passwords on the command line and then hit enter to run the script. Well, that's going to show up in the process listing. So omit, when you're doing any sort of administrative tasks on the command line, omit your passwords. If you omit the password and hit enter, it's going to prompt you for that password. Now, that's fine for interactive manual maintenance, but it's not fine if you're automating maintenance, upgrades, installations, that sort of thing. And so there's another solution there. The solution is to create a boot identity file for each WebLogic server. Okay. So a lot of times in production mode, when we create managed servers and we start them up for the first time, we get prompted for the username and password to connect that managed server to the admin server. Well, we can create the boot identity file by hand. And that's the preferred way to do it, obviously. And you may already be doing this, so this may not be that big of a deal. But each WebLogic server should have its own boot identity file where the username and password is encrypted. That way, you don't have to pass this in on the command line to start a WebLogic server. But what's really important here is if you're going to automate any sort of maintenance, upgrades, installations of WebLogic, use the user config file feature within WebLogic scripting tool. What this allows you to do is to generate essentially a key, an encrypted key that can be used for key-based authentication against WebLogic. And that's a great way to not pass the password on the command line, so it's a visible, I'm using air quotes, plain text. But the user config feature within WebLogic scripting tool is a great way to use a key, an encrypted key, rather than a password. And as I mentioned, omit passwords when you're executing scripts if you're doing stuff interactively. That way somebody doesn't come back and do a history in your shell to see, oh, look, there's the password that they entered in to execute this script. This gets revealed during a lot of corporate security audits quite frequently, actually. It happens a lot more often than you may think. So normally this is where I would open up the floor to you, the audience, to ask any questions on this webinar. but unfortunately I've had to record this, given some of the issues that I've had trying to host a live webinar, a live Q&A session, which I was really hoping to do. I much more prefer interacting with the audience and answering questions live. It's certainly a great learning opportunity for everyone, not just me and the students, but for everyone involved. So if you found this useful and you want to learn more about WebLogic, check out the website. I have courses out there, and I plan on adding a whole lot more. We've got a free beginner's course that you can take, and it's a bit light in the sense that it only covers the installation of WebLogic and the creation of a domain. If you're attending this webinar and you understand what I'm saying, the beginner course obviously isn't for you, but I do have an in-depth course on Oracle WebLogic 12c that covers basically Systems Administration 101 for WebLogic. And it's a great course. It's over 12 or 13 hours. There's a hands-on lab exercise. You certainly get direct access to me if you got any questions. I'm more than happy to work with you to help you learn. This is a great product. There's a lot of great job opportunities out there. You can make some really good money if you know something about WebLogic, and I can attest to that. So I hope you enjoyed this webinar. I hope you found it informational. One thing, so I got to do the whole sales pitch here thing. So the normal price is not $399, but as you view this, I'm going to offer discounts on the course. I really want people to get in there to get learning, and we're gonna cut the price on this so everyone has an opportunity to attend and to view the course. So anyway, I'm going to publish out a discount code to everybody who's attended this webinar, and feel free to use that and check out the course. I think you've got maybe a week or so to evaluate the course to see if it's to your liking. So please take advantage of that. There's obviously no risk. We're now hosted on teachable.com. It's a great platform, I believe, for hosting these sorts of things. So again, thank you very much for attending. Like I said, I hope you found this useful. I'm certainly welcome to feedback. I want to improve this. There's a lot we could have talked about with security, but I really wanted to keep this to under 30 minutes for the webinar. Quick hitting, highlight some of the important things. So anyway, thank you very much and have a great day.